So in this episode, Tony Goldner will focus on how the TNFD framework is guiding corporations and investors to consider the financial impact of nature loss and the role of nature-related financial disclosures in driving sustainable business practices globally. He will also share insights on how the TNFD is engaging with stakeholders, including African stakeholders, to ensure that the framework supports biodiversity and nature-positive financing across the continent. And today on the set, we have Tony Goldner, Executive Director at the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Welcome, Tony.
Hi, Dorothy. Great to be with you.
Good. So we are here at New York Climate Week. Tony, what are some of the emerging themes that you're seeing coming through?
It's a really interesting climate week. I think I just read in the newspapers today, probably the biggest one in the 16 years that it's been running. So it feels crazy busy, thousands of events, lots of walking around New York City. But I think in terms of the conversation, a few things have really struck me. I went to an interesting session around the planetary health check, and Johan Rockström gave what I thought was a pretty clear clarion call for action on nature loss. I mean, the science is telling us that we really have to put the foot on the gas at this point and really start to make some scalable progress. In some of the corporate engagements that I've been doing, a couple of sessions with you, I'm still struck by the fact that a lot of people are coming to the nature conversation for the first time. Obviously been very focused on climate change, and now we're trying to get them to think about all of the other aspects of nature beyond climate. And so there are some people who are charging ahead, and there are other people coming to this for the first time. But I think we've really got to try and push everybody further, faster forward in order to respond to the clear message from the science.
Yeah, but how do we push people forward?
Well, I think what I'm hearing is people want practical tools and guidance to get started. They know they have to embrace this agenda now, but taking that first step feels really big and difficult. I think everyone keeps saying nature is more complex than climate, which of course is true. There's just a lot more that we have to be thinking about. But that doesn't mean it has to be more complicated in terms of practical action on understanding the issues. And that's really what we've tried to focus on at TNFD, is giving people some practical ways of getting started, starting to assess their issues, and then they can figure out, well, what do we have to do to respond to the issues that we have in our business or in our financial portfolio? And how do those actions then contribute back to improving the state of nature, which of course is the ultimate objective. The resilience of business depends on the resilience of nature. And I really think we've got to use this climate week and the conversations to come with COP16 and the other things ahead of us to try and recraft the narrative and the conversation. It needs to be about nature resilience, because we've tended to talk about nature loss. But I think when we anchor the conversation around nature loss, it's really easy for people to say, well, that's government's problem. Yeah. But nature resilience as the basis of business resilience is something that we all have to care about. And I think it's language that works for business and finance.
Yeah, so Tony, I just want to take you back to nature resilience. Why is nature important? And yesterday we had this chat about an event you went for, and it painted to you the stark reality of the challenges that we are facing. Yeah. So why nature? What's the advantage of focusing on nature?
Well, I think we have to start from the premise that we are 100% dependent on the natural world. Yeah. So I like to draw particularly people in business and finance to this word dependency, because as we've all been very focused on climate change, we haven't really talked about our dependence on the atmosphere. It hasn't been part of the conversation and the mental model that people now have about how to respond to climate change. But when we talk about nature, it really is all about dependencies. We have dependencies on the flow of water that nature provides. We have dependencies on the pollination services that nature provides into our agricultural system. And in the science, these are called ecosystem services. So we don't have to get bogged down in scientific language, but the basic point is the assets of nature provide flows into our business models, and we have to recognize that without those flows there would be no business. And sometimes people say, well, I'm in technology, I'm invested in technologies, nature's not really that relevant. Well, actually it's hugely relevant, because we wouldn't all be walking around. We wouldn't be doing this podcast without semiconductor chips.
Yeah.
And the manufacture of semiconductor chips depends on a flow of very high quality water to manufacture chips.
Mm-hmm.
So right there's a dependency in the tech sector on nature.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't take care of nature's ability to continue to provide those flows of services into our business and our business models, then every business is going to be more at risk of disruption from nature-related risks and those dependencies.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I've seen is the planetary boundaries. That presentation by Stockholm Institute on the planetary boundaries. Can you speak a little about that as to maybe a 6-year-old?
Yeah, so I think that's a good challenge.
Yeah.
I think in simple terms, what the scientists have done is take the incredible complexity of nature and boil it down into what they call 9 planetary boundaries, and these are the sort of the key systems and processes that help the planet to function and keep us within this nice steady state that we've been in for hundreds of thousands of years. That's really enabled human prosperity.
Yeah.
Because if you go back millions of years, it was pretty volatile. The climate was much cooler, and we've been through periods of obviously like the Ice Age and things. And then these conditions appeared, which provided an incredibly stable basis for human prosperity to flourish. Mm-hmm. Now we're at risk of going outside of that nice steady state.
Yeah.
And nature's provided this sort of magic set of conditions in which humans have been able to flourish. Mm-hmm. And so, if I were explaining it to a 6-year-old, I'd say, well, there are 9 things that we have to be thinking about.
Yes.
And if we overshoot, we're in trouble. And we've got to stay within those sort of boundaries and those parameters. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, at the moment, we're outside 6 of those 9 planetary boundaries. And so, what was released early this week is this notion of a planetary health check. And it's a bit like putting a thermometer in your sick 6-year-old child, and you pull the thermometer out and it says, well, they have a temperature. Well, at the moment, the planetary health check is telling us the planet has a temperature and it's sick and it needs urgent attention. Mm-hmm. And so, just as we would with a sick child, we need to deal with the underlying causes in order to get back to a healthier state.
And that urgent attention needs to be done now. What is the role of business?
Well, I think everyone has to contribute. Yeah. No one actor in society is going to address this problem. Mm-hmm. We tend to point the finger at government and say, well, governments should just sort all of this out for the rest of us. Mm-hmm. But governments themselves can't sort this out. Of course, they have a very powerful set of tools, policy levers, regulation, all of those things are important. Mm-hmm. But they're only important if the rest of society responds to the policy that's put in place or the regulatory architecture that the government's put into place. So business and finance have a huge role to play in stepping up. Massive consumers of the resources that we get from nature. Mm-hmm. So we have to be smarter about reducing our burden on the planet and the resources that we use. But more excitingly, I think harnessing the innovation of the private sector is going to be key to finding solutions to halting and reversing nature loss. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about doing less bad to the planet. It's also about actually working with the planet and those planetary systems to find new solutions to getting the planet back into a healthy state.
And that is part of what the TNFD framework attempts to do?
Yeah, so we look at 4 things, essentially. We look at the impacts and dependencies that business and finance have on nature.
Yes.
And then we look at the consequential risks and opportunities to the organization.
Yes.
So we point in 2 directions. We look at those things relevant to the planet and things relevant to business and finance. Mm-hmm. And as a business, you can't understand the risks to your business if you have not already understood the impacts and dependencies you have on the planet.
Yes.
So that's why this word, the D word, the dependency word, is so important, because dependencies and impacts are linked, but dependencies is also the basis upon which there'll be risks to the organization. Mm-hmm. So we look across those things. We also cover the 4 realms of nature, so land, freshwater, oceans, and the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. The one thing we don't cover is greenhouse gas emissions, because those were dealt with by our big sister initiative, the TCFD, that came before us. Mm-hmm. But for example, they did not cover things like air pollution. So we've looked at other aspects of our impacts on the atmosphere other than the GHG emissions, which everyone's been very focused on for a long time.
And so the framework, what does it do? Where would an organization start? And at the same time, if you can speak a little about your early adopters.
Yeah, great.
You know, how is that going?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things in the toolkit that companies need. So the first thing is we want every business, big, small, family-owned, publicly listed, everyone should be thinking about understanding how nature's relevant to their business or to their financial portfolio. So the first thing we do is provide a set of assessment tools to help companies figure out, what are my potential issues? How am I impacting on nature? What are those dependencies? And then what might be the risks and opportunities to the organization. So we provide a process, we call it the LEAP approach, which helps people work through a step-by-step process or a phase-by-phase process to figure out how nature's relevant to their business. And everyone should be doing that. Family-owned farming operations should be having a look because they're at the front line of interaction with nature. We saw with COVID and we've seen with extreme weather events that sometimes it's the small family businesses and the farmers and the fishermen who are the most impacted. Their businesses and their livelihoods can be wiped out by not understanding their exposure to nature-related issues. But then clearly we need to get the really big global corporations also thinking about this. So the first step is to understand and assess your nature-related issues. And then many companies have requirements to report publicly to their shareholders. The most obvious example is companies listed on a stock exchange, for example. And so that's called disclosure, and we provide a set of disclosure recommendations. So that's basically the information that you should be providing to your shareholders so that they are fully informed about relevant issues to do with your interactions with nature. And that's building on the work of the TCFD that came before us on climate, which is now pretty widely accepted. And that information should go alongside their mainstream financial reports, like their profit and loss, their balance sheet, and their cash flow statements. So we're building on existing market practice around reporting, but we're going further in providing people with a set of tools to help them do their homework and do the internal assessment work around what's really relevant for my business.
So, Tony, it doesn't need to be the big corporates, mid-sized organizations, small entities, small enterprises, family-owned. Anybody can actually take on the TNFD.
I think for the assessment piece, yes, and that's in their own self-interest.
Yes.
Again, back to the word resilience.
Yes.
It's about the resilience of your business. And lowering your impact on the planet so that we can improve the resilience of nature. And that's in everybody's self-interest because if the bees don't show up, the farmer might not have a crop next year or the year after. Right? If you're a manufacturing business in a water-stressed area and you need water into your production processes, you don't want to be out of business in 3 or 4 years' time because you've got no more access to water. So it's about the enlightened self-interest of companies and figuring out these issues that might be relevant to their business. And then, of course, for the bigger firms, there's that additional layer of responsibility to provide information to the organizations and the shareholders that provide them with capital.
So, Tony, exactly a year ago, I witnessed the launch of the TNFD. I actually
it was
called
great, wasn't it?
It was. It was my first time at the New York Stock Exchange, so of course that was something. Oh, yours too?
Yeah. Well, on the floor of the exchange.
On the floor of the, yes. I described that, launch as I witnessed a battle cry at the New York Stock Exchange. And for me, the battle cry was largely not a cry of defeat, but a resounding call to action. How has it been since the launch? How is your adoption going? What are you seeing? What are the trends?
So as you point out, it's been a year and a week since New York. It was the 18th of September last year. When we did a nature takeover of the New York Stock Exchange, which was a lot of fun. And the response we've seen since then has been really encouraging. So we've now got over 400 organizations globally now voluntarily using the TNFD recommendations to start doing that assessment work and making those public disclosures. So that represents about $6 trillion in market capitalization amongst the listed public companies. We've also had a lot of private companies contact us and say, we want to do this. We think it's important for our business, which is terrific. And we've also, if we think about it from a financial institution's perspective, it also represents about $16 trillion in assets under management.
Okay.
So that's from asset owners and asset managers.
Yes.
And importantly, it also includes about 25% of what are called the GSIBs, which are the globally, I'm going to get the acronym wrong now, globally systemic important institutional banks.
Okay.
So these are the really big banks that kind of run the global financial system for us. And we've got 25% of those banks committed now to nature-related reporting. So that's really significant because they obviously, through their lending practice, influence the behavior of millions, tens of millions of businesses around the world.
Yeah.
And so if we start to see the banks thinking about these issues and then asking questions around companies that they're lending to, small businesses that they're lending to, that's going to help to change the mindset across value chains around the world.
So the call to action,
loud and clear.
Loud and clear.
Yeah.
Tony, if you look at the adoption, how is it in terms of, the regions, and what's your strategy towards growth?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think what we've been really impressed by is we've got TNFD reporters now from, I think, over 40 jurisdictions around the world.
Okay.
From all parts of the world.
Yeah.
Really interesting response from Africa, from Kenya, from South Africa. We've got some signs of interest in Nigeria, which is great. Across Asia, huge response in Japan. And I think we've got more work to do in the US, obviously for political reasons. Right now, ESG is a hot topic.
Exactly.
People are keeping their head down. But I think certainly there's a lot of interest here in the US. So I think we'll see how this plays out over the next year or two. But also not just across geographies, but across sectors.
Yes.
So we've also got a tremendous response from companies pretty much across most of the major industry sectors that are sort of, classified by different industry codes. If you were to look at those codes and say, is there a company doing TNFD now? We've pretty much got at least one or two from nearly every sector. So that's encouraging, but still a long way to go, right? I think global capital markets are in the hundreds of trillions and we're at 16. So we've got our work cut out for us. But I think it's really about, in terms of the growth that you mentioned, what we'd like to do is showcase how early movers are getting started, because I think that's going to inspire others to then step up. So we'll be spending a lot of time in the next year or two on capability building, on education and training, on showcasing how people are getting started so it can inspire others. And the third thing we're doing is trying to make it easier for companies to find the data that they need to do this assessment work.
Yes. Tony, let's talk about the data.
Yeah, let's do data.
It's, the challenge, the big data challenge, not just in Africa, I presume. What is the TNFD going to do about that?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with what we've heard from the market. We've consistently heard, there's no data, we can't do this. But I think there's actually tons of nature data out there. I think the real issue is this is just new and unfamiliar.
Okay.
And so people in business and finance don't know where to find the data that's already there.
Yeah.
And of course, there have been scientific and conservation organizations that have been collecting nature-related data for decades. But most people in business and finance haven't had a need for it. So they don't know where to go and find it.
Yeah.
So the first thing is discovery, like how do I find the data that's relevant to me?
Yeah.
And how accessible is that data? And then the third issues are really around comparability of data.
Yes.
The timeliness of the data. So it's no good trying to do an analysis now of data that might be 10 years old from the point in which it was collected.
Yeah.
And then the final issue, as we now see this wave of new demand for nature data from business and finance, is going to be assurability. Because, of course, companies don't want to make public statements if they can't have those statements backed by an independent assurance process. So we've got a whole set of new challenges around nature data. So what are we doing? We're working with our scientific and nature data partners to think about ways to improve those issues of accessibility, cost, comparability, and assurability. And we're working at the moment on the design of what we're calling a global nature data public facility. So this would be a sort of open access platform pulling through data from existing data providers. and making that easier for people in business and finance to find.
Wow.
For the purposes of doing their nature-related assessments, so using the TNFD toolkit, but potentially also for target setting as companies start to think about transition plans and target setting around nature, as they're now doing for net zero on the climate side.
Mm-hmm.
So there's clearly a huge, and this demand, we're right at the beginning of a takeoff, I think, in demand for nature data.
Mm-hmm.
So there's huge demand, but it's difficult, it's unfamiliar, and there's definitely issues around gaps in the data and the comparability of the data, and the assurability of the data. So we're trying to work with our partners to provide a way to address those needs.
So Tony, let me just get this. If I was a data provider, does that mean the TNFD work is going to drive me out of business?
No, I think we explicitly are not trying to create something that duplicates what's already there.
Yeah.
And it's also the case that there's literally thousands of data points around nature that scientific organizations and other data providers have been collecting for decades.
Mm-hmm.
But you could say the same thing about economic data. And for most business and finance, most of that data is not going to be relevant to their needs.
Yeah.
It might be relevant for government policymakers, or it might be relevant for scientific organizations.
Mm-hmm.
So we're definitely not trying to duplicate the data collection process that others already have in place. It's really about filtering the data points that are relevant for business and finance and making that fairly small focused set of data points easier for people to find and access relevant data around.
Mm-hmm. But the role of government and the role of, public data is still very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how does this link to natural capital accounting, natural capital valuation? How does all this link together?
Well, I think the common link is demand from business and finance for nature data.
Yeah.
You're talking about natural capital accounting. That would be almost the next stage beyond a basic understanding of nature, would be to then develop what you've accurately called a natural capital account, which is a specific, almost like a set of financial accounts, but for nature-related impacts.
Mm-hmm.
So we're starting to see companies doing that work now. But the underpinning of all of that is access to good data.
The data. Yeah.
And so a lot of it's there. Some of it isn't there. The other thing that's happening is the private sector organizations like satellite companies are now providing a wealth of new nature data.
Yes.
So it's not just about the legacy data sets and systems that have been around and collected by governments and UN bodies and others for ages. It's about also making access or creating access to a lot of this new data that's now being provided by new tech startups. We've got some very exciting new technologies, eDNA, LiDAR.
Exactly.
All of these things are going to provide a wealth of new data that we need to be able to make available to those who need it.
So your work on data is really cut out for you.
Well, it's cut out as in terms of the scale of the challenge.
The scale of the challenge, yeah.
But to be clear, TNFD is not, we're not set up to build a new data facility or become a data provider.
Yes.
What we are doing is identifying a need and trying to catalyze the creation of something that will be built in the future, but it won't be sort of owned and operated by TNFD. We're just responding to the market need and trying to improve the situation and catalyze the development of the solutions.
So as the data side develops, I'm sure I'll be calling you back to give us great, the insights on the data work.
Yeah.
But at the moment, let's talk about all these global frameworks discussions that are going on. The ISSB, we have SBTN, GRI. There's so much.
There is.
And many institutions then struggle and ask themselves, why do we need to look at TNFD? And, there are all these other frameworks. And then how does that fit into, the ISSB standards? What's the plan? How do we go about that?
Well, I think you're right. There's a lot of acronyms floating around. There's, repeated jokes about the alphabet soup, which we all contribute to. And some of us don't even get the acronyms right of the other organizations. So legitimately, it can be confusing to make sense of. But I think when you see the connections between the different initiatives in the organizations, you can see that people are building on each other's work, and I think this space is going to be rationalized in the coming years. So, for example, a TNFD like TCFD we want to put ourselves out of business. In a couple of years' time, we should disappear. Because our goal is to get our recommendations, and they're not standards, they're recommendations from the market. We want those recommendations reflected into the standards, and they could be voluntary standards or they could be regulated standards from government. Once we see that has happened, it'll be time for the TNFD as a task force to dissolve ourselves and to wrap up our work. So that'll take a few letters out of the alphabet soup, right? But I think the way the landscape is evolving is we've got the policy goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which are informing frameworks like TNFD and target setting groups like SBTN. Ultimately, we want to see that advice and those methods reflected in voluntary standards, which is principally the ISSB and GRI. ISSB for risk and opportunities, GRI for impacts. And those voluntary standards are already used by tens of thousands of companies around the world. So for those companies using those standards, it's going to be business as usual. It's just there'll be new standards that you'll need to think about adopting. One of them will be on nature, or maybe several of them will be on nature. And then, of course, governments tend to look at what's happening in the voluntary standard space to inspire the design of their own regulation. And so I think what we're going to see, as we've already seen in Europe and in other jurisdictions like India, which has something called BRSR, nature will be built into the regulated disclosure requirements by governments. It's now in place in Europe. We worked very closely with the Europeans on the design of their standards, reflecting and leveraging the work of the TNFD. And we're now working with the ISSB to help inform their research on nature-related issues, which is already underway.
So the encouragement for early adopters is that you start on the journey. Once they become, part of the standards, then they're way ahead, isn't it?
I think that's right. I think there are two reasons to get started early, at least.
At least two.
I can probably give you more, but I'll focus on two. One is, and this is what we're hearing from the market, from the 400 odd organizations that have got started. One is when you ask them, why did you sign up? Why are you doing this now? The first is because they realize they've got nature-related issues in their business, and it's in their own self-interest to get on top of those issues now. No point waiting 3 or 4 years, because something could come along and disrupt the business. And that's not good for the business. It's not good for the shareholders or anybody else, the customers. So the first thing is just a sense of enlightened self-interest that we want to get on top of these issues now to better manage the business. The second issue is around obviously preparing for an expectation that there'll be regulation in the future. And because the ISSB has said that they're going to leverage and build on the TNFD recommendations, there's now a sense that this is all in a glide path, right? So the TNFD recommendations will influence the GRI and ISSB standards, and those standards will influence what might be coming in the future in terms of regulation. So everyone who's getting started now is saying that it's really helping to build their capabilities internally and their confidence to do this work. And what's noticeable in Europe with the new CSRD reporting requirements is I've had Chief Sustainability Officer come up to me in the last 6 months. You're sweating profusely from the brow, saying, "I've got 6 months, and what do I do? Like, where do I start with TNFD?" But those who did a pilot test with us 2 years ago are feeling quite comfortable, and they've gone through this process. They've learnt a lot. They've built some internal capability, and so they're feeling quite confident about their ability to do their CSRD reporting. So all of that really does point to the fact that there's huge benefit in moving early rather than waiting until the last minute. Not only to prepare for regulation, which is obviously a compliance mindset around TNFD, but because it's in your own best interest of managing your business.
I can confidently say that of the 21 African financial institutions who are part of the Africa pilot that we are running with the anchor. So that I fully agree. But let's talk about the opportunity piece. Business wants to understand what's the opportunity side of things.
It's a great question, and it's coming up a lot more frequently. And my point, and I actually made this point earlier this week here at Climate Week, whenever the word opportunity comes up, people immediately think about an investment opportunity as if we're all working in private equity and we're looking for a 20% return within 6 or 7 years. And that's one type of opportunity. But I think we need to, when we think about nature-related opportunities, I think we have to think about a broader set of opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And there can be a huge amount of opportunities about making your business more resilient in the face of nature risk. So one type of opportunity might be that by adopting TNFD and demonstrating that you are understanding and managing your nature-related issues, maybe that lowers your insurance premiums.
Yes.
Maybe it gives you better access to credit on better terms, right? So your cost of capital might go down. Of course, then there might also be, you might go through a leap assessment and see a whole wealth of new places where you can be an investor and support new startups. It might be a data startup or a new product, regenerative farming product or innovation. And I remember you telling a story about some of your earlier work where you created this kind of wow moment about sort of unlocking like a vision or a sense of understanding of where else an investment firm can deploy capital maybe ahead of the curve. So I think we've got to take a slightly broader view of what an opportunity means. It's not always going to be about a $50 million investment that's going to deliver a 20% return in the next 5 years. There's a whole range of ways in which companies can create opportunities for themselves. And the other one, of course, is competitive advantage. If you're fielding questions from investors about how you're managing these issues and your competitors clearly are not on this agenda, you're likely to get rewarded by your banks, by your investors, by customers. So, that in itself is another opportunity which could translate into market share, particularly as customers become more discerning about the kind of products we buy and sell, because people don't want to be damaging their natural environment. So companies that are innovating new products may be going to create new commercial opportunities and market share for themselves.
So, Tony, a couple of months back, you visited Nairobi.
Yeah.
Actually, you visited Nairobi and Naivasha. In Nairobi, you met a couple of TNFD early adopters.
Yeah.
But I want to specifically speak about the trip to the flower farm. How was that for you?
It was amazing.
What was amazing about it?
Well, first of all, I was thrilled to be back in Kenya, having spent my 2 years of my early career there as a diplomat. So it was incredible to see the transformation of Kenya in 20-something years. I won't date myself, but it was a long time ago.
Yes.
But going out to the flower farm was just a fantastic, I thought, opportunity to see firsthand how a high-growth business in an emerging economy like Kenya's is both doing well but has very critical nature-related dependencies. In that case, particularly around water, but not just the water required for the flower farm, but also, for me, I came away with a much greater sense of understanding about how the quality of the water is dependent on the actions not just of one flower farm, but everybody in the Naivasha area.
Exactly.
And so I was really impressed to hear about these kind of collaborative initiatives around the water basin to try and protect the source of the water. And of course, as the population has grown in the area, the water table has fallen, which of course places more pressure on the flower farm businesses. So it was, I think, a really good reminder that very few businesses can solve these issues on their own. And so there is a huge amount of incentive, I think, to join in collaborative efforts within an ecosystem or a watershed to be managing those resources, those natural resources, in a much more sustainable way, because that then is beneficial for everyone.
Wow. So, Tony, if you had, and that was an excellent experience, you keep talking about it. If you had a magic wand, and you could do anything in relation to nature and biodiversity across the globe, what would that one thing be?
Wow.
Hard question, right?
Well, I think back to the idea of nature resilience. What I find striking is the science is telling us we've got to act urgently, but there doesn't seem to be a corresponding sense of urgency from policymakers and from business and finance. And we know as humans, we're generally not very good at preparing for crisis. We deal with it when it hits, right? Because we think maybe we'll get away with it and it won't actually happen.
Yes, at least possibly not in our lifetime, right?
So my one big wish, and I've been spending a bit of time trying to think about this, is can we get governments to pay for nature resilience outcomes?
Okay.
Because typically everyone keeps talking about nature loss and conservation. And so governments think, well, we have an annual budget for environmental protection and conservation.
Yeah.
But I think if we reframe it as an issue around resilience, that the whole of the economy and our societies sit on top of the resilience of nature, it helps, I think, to reframe the challenge that's ahead and the imperative for action. And I often draw the analogy to infrastructure, right? So with population growth, governments have found it pretty easy to justify spending billions of dollars on a new airport or a new toll road or more hospitals. But why not use the same logic to apply to investing in nature as infrastructure? So I think if we can create, my one wish would be to create this idea of sort of thinking about nature the way we think about infrastructure, and getting governments to invest in the long term in nature resilience in the same way that they invest in the long term in, say, a toll road project, because then we can crowd in private sector finance around government's willingness to pay over a 20, 30-year time frame, just as they do with economic infrastructure like a toll road or an airport or a hospital.
Wow.
And we know that we've got the toolkit to do that. It's the work that's been done over the last 30 years around public-private partnerships and blended finance.
Yeah.
But now we should be thinking about blended finance for nature as infrastructure. So, the really big challenge now is taking the finance that we need to scale. And there's lots of exciting projects around, blue bonds and green bonds and private equity investments into fast-growing new products, but it's all quite small scale. $30, $40, $50 million. And so the really big money is still sitting on the sideline. The pension funds and the large institutional investors. We have to get that money into this problem, but they need bigger ticket size. They need to be deploying $300, $400, $500 million.
Exactly.
And so we need different investment models to pull in that money. And I think the idea of nature, treating nature as in the way in which we treat infrastructure as an investment proposition, could be one of the ways in which we change that equation.
Tony, that is profound. Blended finance for nature as infrastructure, really, really profound. And, I can't wait to see what governments will do over time. And I think we all have a role to play. And the private sector has a role to play. Yeah. So, Tony, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for taking your time out of a very busy schedule in New York. Crazy traffic, lots of meetings.
Fire engines,
and everything else. But you made the time to join us for the Anchor podcast. We really, really, really supportive of what you're doing. And watch this space. Watch this space.
Very good. Well, thanks, Dorothy, for everything you're doing. We've had a great collaboration over the last couple of years, and we're looking forward to doing more with you. So thanks for having me on the show today.
Thank you, Tony. Can I greet you?
Of course.
So, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Tony Goldner, Executive Director, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures.